The house was sold. You're homeless now. My mother-in-law said it like she was reading a grocery list. Calm, cold, satisfied. She stood beside my husband on our front porch, holding a stack of divorce papers against her chest, while the afternoon wind pushed silver hair across her face. Daniel wouldn't even look me in the eye. I remember standing in the driveway, still holding my purse, still smiling from what had happened less than an hour earlier. $7 million. My grandmother Margaret had left me $7 million and her estate in the mountains. I had cried the entire drive home. Happy tears, foolish, hopeful tears. I kept imagining my husband lifting me off the ground when I told him. I imagined us finally breathing again after years of financial strain. Instead, Daniel stood on the porch beside his mother like a stranger waiting to evict a tenant. The movers already came, Sandra continued. Your things are in storage. I blinked slowly. What? Daniel finally spoke, but his voice sounded rehearsed. It's over, Catherine, over. 26 years of marriage, reduced to 2 words from a man who once drove 5 hours through a blizzard just to bring me soup when I had the flu. I looked past them toward the house. The flower boxes I planted that spring were gone. The porch swing Daniel built 8 years ago was missing. Even the curtains had changed. That's when I understood. This hadn't happened suddenly. This had been planned, carefully, quietly, probably for months. Sandra stepped down one stair and extended the papers toward me. You should sign while things are still civil. Civil, I almost laughed. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. When were you going to tell me? Daniel rubbed his forehead like I was exhausting him. Catherine, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Harder. I thought about the leather folder sitting in my car, the attorney shaking my hand that morning, the way my grandmother had smiled during her final weeks whenever Sandra's name came up. That smile suddenly made sense. Sandra folded her arms. You'll land on your feet. Women always do. There was something almost impressive about how cruel she could sound while pretending to be reasonable. I had known that woman since I was 35 years old. She hated me before she knew me. Not openly. Sandra Whitmore was too polished for that, too practiced, too experienced at delivering poison wrapped inside compliments. Oh, Catherine, you're braver than Daniel's usual type. You've always been so independent. Some men find that exhausting eventually. Small cuts, year after year, and Daniel always defended her. She doesn't mean it that way. That became the anthem of our marriage. Sandra glanced toward the street impatiently. You should leave before the buyers arrive. Buyers. Then Daniel looked directly at me for the first time. The house sold 3 days ago. 3 days ago, I was sitting beside my grandmother's hospital bed, holding her hand while she struggled to breathe. 3 days ago, my husband was apparently selling our home behind my back. Something inside me should have shattered right then. But it didn't, because at that exact moment, a memory surfaced. 3 months earlier, Grandma Margaret sitting at her kitchen table while snow fell outside. Never let other people rush you into signing papers, she had told me. I remembered laughing softly. Grandma, you sound paranoid. No, she said calmly. I sound old. At the time I thought she was just being cautious. Now I wasn't so sure. Sandra shoved the papers closer toward me. You can sign now or later. Makes no difference to us. Us, not Daniel, us. That single word told me everything. This wasn't just a marriage ending. This was a removal, an extraction. And Sandra had orchestrated it. Daniel finally sighed. The house was under my name, Catherine. Legally, there's nothing you can do. That sentence almost made me smile. Almost. Instead, I asked quietly, you sold it already? Finalized everything? He nodded once. Sandra smirked. You always were too trusting. There it was, not anger, not heartbreak. Contempt. They thought I was weak, simple, manageable, and honestly, I probably had been. At least until that morning. At least until Margaret's attorney slid those documents across the desk. At least until I realized my grandmother had spent years quietly preparing for something I didn't yet fully understand. A strange calm settled over me. The kind people feel right before a car crash. Or right after one. I looked up at both of them standing on my porch, at my husband, at the woman who had spent nearly 3 decades slowly trying to erase me from her son's life. Then I smiled. A real smile. Daniel frowned immediately. What's so funny? I glanced at the papers in Sandra's hands, then at the house behind them. The house Daniel proudly believed he had sold. And softly I said, actually, the house you sold belonged to. Neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the trees. Sandra's expression shifted for the first time all afternoon. Confusion. Just a flicker, but enough. Daniel tried to recover first. What does that mean? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because after 26 years together, he knew my face. He knew when I was bluffing. And this wasn't bluffing. The sound of a vehicle turning onto the street broke the silence. A black SUV rolled slowly toward the curb. Daniel straightened his shirt nervously. Sandra forced a smile onto her face. 2 men stepped out, one younger, clearly an attorney. The other around 70, silver-haired, expensive coat, calm posture. The kind of man who walks into tense rooms without fear. The older man looked directly at me first. Not Daniel, not Sandra, me. Interesting timing, he said. Daniel stepped forward quickly. Daniel Whitmore. We spoke on the phone. The older man shook his hand briefly. Robert Hale. Sandra immediately shifted into hostess mode. We're just finishing a family matter. Robert's eyes rested on the divorce papers still in Daniel's hand. Yes, he said. I can see that. Then he turned toward me. You must be Catherine, I nodded. He studied me carefully for a moment, then said the 6 words that changed everything. Your grandmother spoke very highly of you. Daniel froze. Sandra blinked hard. The air shifted. Robert reached into his coat pocket and removed a small envelope. Cream-colored. My grandmother's handwriting across the front. My heart stopped. He held it carefully between 2 fingers. She asked me to deliver this personally, he said, but only under specific circumstances. He paused. She said if this house was ever sold without your full knowledge, he looked directly at Daniel. There would likely be some confusion about ownership. Daniel laughed nervously. What confusion? Robert didn't look at him. Instead, he handed me the envelope. My hands trembled slightly as I took it. Across the front in Margaret's careful script, for Catherine, if Sandra finally gets her way. A cold wave moved through me slowly. Not fear, recognition. My grandmother knew. Somehow she knew. Robert's attorney quietly opened a folder. Before anyone proceeds with this property, he said calmly, we should discuss the trust agreement connected to the estate. Trust agreement. Daniel's face lost color instantly. Sandra whispered, what trust? And standing there in the driveway with evening light dropping behind the hills, I suddenly understood. Margaret hadn't simply left me money, she had left me protection. The younger attorney spoke carefully. 6 years ago, he explained, Mrs. Margaret Calloway quietly transferred a protected ownership percentage connected to this property after assisting with Mr. Whitmore's financial liabilities. My mind snapped backward instantly. 6 years earlier, Daniel's business had nearly collapsed. We almost lost everything. Months of panic over loans and debt collectors. Then suddenly, everything stabilized. When I asked how, Daniel said Sandra had helped arrange financing. But I also remembered a phone call. Grandma Margaret, late one evening, don't worry about the house, she had said softly. I handled it. I thought she meant emotional support. I understand now she meant something far more literal. Daniel's voice came out unsteady. What percentage? Enough, the attorney said, to complicate unauthorized sale proceedings. Sandra exploded. Daniel, what did you sign? There were hundreds of pages, and you signed them without reading. You told me the refinancing had to move fast. The silence that followed was almost painful. Because suddenly the truth was standing naked in front of all of us. They weren't masterminds. They were greedy amateurs who had walked directly into a trap my grandmother built years before either of them thought to start planning. Robert adjusted his coat calmly. My legal team identified the issue this afternoon during final review. The buyers were not informed about the active trust entanglements attached to this property. Sandra pointed at me furiously. She knew about this, I didn't, I said honestly. And it was true, I hadn't, not fully, but Margaret had. That realization settled deep inside me. My grandmother had spent years watching quietly, while Sandra moved through our lives like a woman rearranging furniture inside someone else's home. And she prepared accordingly, patiently. Without ever saying a word, Daniel turned toward me desperately. "Catherine, we can figure this out. We interesting. 10 minutes ago I was homeless. Now suddenly we existed again." I folded the letter carefully. "You already figured things out, Daniel. That's not fair." I laughed softly before I could stop myself. Not cruelly, just tired. "You sold our house while I was sitting with my dying grandmother." Sandra interrupted. "It was legally his property." Robert looked at her directly for the first time. "That assumption," he said quietly, "may become very expensive." Sandra went pale. The younger attorney closed the folder. Robert looked toward the house. "Now we pause everything," he said, "before someone makes this considerably worse." Daniel turned back to me. "You knew this would happen." "No. Then why were you smiling?" I looked at him quietly for a long moment. "Because," I finally said, "for the first time in years I wasn't trapped anymore. Not financially, not emotionally. Not inside a marriage where every decision quietly passed through Sandra first." Robert gently nodded toward the letter. "There's more." I looked back down and kept reading. "Catherine, if Sandra is standing nearby while you read this, then I imagine she still believes money is what makes people powerful. But real power is patience. And people who underestimate quiet women usually regret it eventually." I could practically hear my grandmother's voice in every word. Sandra looked furious enough to crack. Daniel seemed smaller, somehow older. Robert spoke softly. "Your grandmother asked me to help if it ever came to this." "Why?" I whispered. He smiled sadly. "Because she loved you." That nearly broke me. Not the money, not the house, just that. The simple certainty that someone had seen everything happening around me for years and cared enough to prepare for it quietly, patiently, without ever asking for credit. Daniel stepped down from the porch. "Catherine," I held up one hand. He stopped, and for the first time in our marriage, he actually listened. "Robert suggested we continue somewhere private." Sandra objected immediately. "We are not going anywhere over invented legal nonsense." Robert didn't react. He simply turned toward me. "Catherine." It struck me then that nobody had genuinely asked what I wanted in a very long time. Daniel decided. Sandra influenced, and I adapted, smoothed things over, kept the peace, stayed quiet. Slowly disappeared. But standing there with my grandmother's letter still in my hands, I realized I was finished with that kind of peace. "I'd like to hear the rest," I said. Robert nodded once. As we walked toward our cars, Daniel followed me halfway down the driveway. "Catherine, wait." I stopped but didn't turn around. His voice softened. "You know I never meant to hurt you." I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. The sentence men use when they mean I knew exactly what I was doing, but I'd prefer not to own it. I turned around and looked at him one last time. Really looked at him. At the man I had spent most of my adult life trusting. The man with kind eyes who once drove through a blizzard for soup. The man who had stood on that porch 3 hours ago ready to leave me with nothing. "I know," I said simply. "That's the saddest part." And I walked to my car. Margaret Calloway had been many things in her life. Quietly fierce, deeply patient. A woman who understood that the most dangerous battles are never fought loudly. They are won years before anyone realizes a war was happening. She had watched Sandra carefully for decades. She had watched Daniel grow smaller beside her. She had watched me absorb it all and smile and stay. And she had prepared for this day long before I ever thought to. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. I reached into the back seat and pulled out the leather folder from the attorney's office. The one with my name on it. The one containing the estate documents, the inheritance details, and the quiet, patient, devastating legal architecture my grandmother had built to protect me from people who thought I could simply be removed. I set it on the passenger seat, looked at the house one last time, then I drove away.